Hi, and welcome back to the Google Cloud Essentials course. This is Brandon, and in this lesson, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about networking. Okay, so first up, I want to talk about virtual private cloud networks. And I'm going to keep it pretty basic here. This is an Essentials course, and I don't want to overload you with a bunch of network stuff that we won't really get into. So I'm going to stick with the VPC and a little bit of load balancing for this lesson. Now, I want to cover VPC because we inherently are attached to a VPC network when we set up any instances for the app engine or the compute engine. And before I go further, the definition here is a VPC is a global private virtual network partition that adds managed networking functionality to your Google Cloud resources. Okay, when it says global, it means it's actually global. Like you get a segment of a network that spans across all of the regions within the Google Cloud platform. At least all of the regions that you have resources available in will be represented on the network. VPC properties. It provides a global private communication space. So like I said, no matter where your resources are in Google Cloud's infrastructure, they'll be able to communicate with each other in a private manner over this VPC network. It's shareable amongst projects in an organization, so you can actually span a VPC across projects in your organization. It doesn't all have to be in the same project. I mean, all of your resources that you need communication between over this private network don't necessarily have to be on the same project. It allows Google Cloud resources to communicate over a private network, and it can be secured with native IAM, identity access management, integration, and support. Networks and subnets. So all projects have at least one VPC. And as I mentioned before, whenever you stand up a compute instance, you're going to be attached to at least a default VPC unless you specify another one. And if there is no VPC in existence, it will be created for you. It will be a default VPC. All right, VPC networks are global, like I mentioned before. The auto mode provides one subnet in each region. Specific IP ranges, more subnets may require a custom mode VPC. So with custom, you can specify more than one subnet in a region, or you can choose alternative IP ranges. So those are the two major advantages of using custom. All right, so the different IP addresses in Google Cloud are there's different versions of external and internal. And when I say internal, I mean specific to the VPC. All right, and IP addresses in general, they're assigned to many resources in Google Cloud. Compute instances, load balancers, app instances, containers, they all have an IP address associated with them. And like I mentioned, there are two major types. We've got external and internal. External's public facing, and internal lives inside of our private network. It lives inside of our VPC network. All right, so external IP addresses. We've got a couple different types, ephemeral and static. External indicates they're public-facing IPs, and like I mentioned, they're ephemeral or static. Static remains consistent, useful for point-of-access resources like a web application or a public-facing load balancer. So if you want to set up a domain for your web application, you may want a static address to assign it to. Ephemeral is the default mode, so you won't receive a static IP unless you set it up and configure it, and there's a small fee associated with it. The deal about ephemeral is if you change or restart or stop your resource, you'll get a new IP address, a new external IP address. So you have to weigh those. For the most part, internal services to your application, you don't mind too much that the IP address changes. There are elegant ways to solve the problem of changing IPs when you have control internally in your network. But anything that's public facing, you may want to use a static external IP address. All right, a couple of features here. Load balancing. All right, so we're going to cover load balancing. We're going to actually configure it a little bit later. Google Cloud can load balance between instance groups. Now, your nodes or your instances have to be part of an instance group in order to be load balanced. So even if you only had 2 nodes you wanted to balance between, you may add, the 2 nodes, one each, to 2 separate instance groups. And it helps with scale. It helps overcome failed or unhealthy nodes. So on the scale thing, if your instance is reaching some peak utilization, the load balancer will go ahead and move requests over to another instance that's available, or another instance group. And also, it kind of works as a failover, a form of redundancy. If you have a failed or unhealthy node, it will also transfer over to a node that can serve the request. And again, it helps with heavy traffic, helps with scale, and it also helps with limiting latency. So you can route to the closest VM, all other things equal, and it will limit the latency in that manner. Now, auto-scaling removes or adds instances to an instance group based on load. And you can optimize cost while improving tolerance to load. So if you've got an application, you're just starting out, and you don't know how much traffic to anticipate, but you also don't want to use a bunch of resources anticipating some huge popularity that brings in a lot of traffic, you actually get the best of both worlds with auto-scaling, because you can allocate just a couple of resources and configure auto-scaling. And if you don't get a lot of traffic initially, you're just going to use what you need. And that's kind of a central concept behind Google Cloud. You only pay for what you use. You never pay for more. The opposite paradigm would be a traditional data center, where you have hardware everywhere, and you're paying for it, you're anticipating load, and there's no way to dynamically allocate resources. It's one of the big advantages of cloud computing. All right, so in that way you kind of optimize cost. All right, well, that's all I wanted to cover for networking in this little overview lesson. We'll get a little bit more into detail in the next couple of lessons on different things we can do, configuring VPCs and load balancing. But for now, I just want to get the topics fresh in your head and get you thinking about it. So that's it for now. Go ahead and mark the lesson complete and move on to the next. Thank you so much for taking the time, and bye for now.